From the cold northern seas they came, longships cutting across the waves like blades through silk, sails stretched red and white against the storm. The world knew them by many names: raiders, pirates, invaders, but history remembers them as the Vikings. To friend and foe alike, they were warriors of the North, men and women forged in the crucible of battle, bound to gods of war and fate, and carried by the thunder of their shields and the roar of their voices. Across the shores of Europe, from the green valleys of Ireland to the rivers of Russia, from the coasts of England to the walls of Constantinople, their very name inspired terror. And tonight we journey into their world, their battles, their weapons, and the Viking way of war. Welcome, traveler, to the saga of the Norse. If you are drawn to tales of steel, blood, and legend, you have found your place among us. Stay close, for the shield wall is forming, and no one stands alone. This is the story of the warriors of the North. Before we step into their ranks, take up your shield and stand with us in this great hall of history. Strike your hammer upon the like button. Let your voice be heard in the comments as though they were the songs of a skald. And join our fellowship by subscribing to the channel so that the sagas may continue. Now, the ravens are circling, the war horns are sounding, and our tale begins. The Viking warrior was more than a man with a sword. He was a creature of land and sea, a raider and a farmer, a sailor and a mercenary, a merchant and a killer. His weapons were more than tools of violence. They were symbols of status, faith, and identity. And his battles were never fought blindly. Behind the fury and the fire lay a discipline, a strategy, a way of war that was as much about cunning as it was about strength. To understand the Vikings, we must understand their weapons, their ships, their tactics, and the spirit that drove them to fight. It begins with the sea, for without it, the Viking would not exist. The longship was the beating heart of Viking warfare. Sleek, fast, and terrifying, it was not merely a vessel but a weapon itself. Built from oak, with clinker-built planks overlapping like the scales of a serpent, the longship was both light and strong. Its shallow draft allowed it to skim across the ocean, yet slip silently into rivers, carrying warriors deep inland where no enemy expected them. With a single ship, a band of Vikings could appear at the very gates of a monastery or the walls of a town before the alarm bells even rang. With a fleet, they could bring kingdoms to their knees. But it was not the ship alone that inspired fear. It was those who sailed upon it. The crew of a longship was a war band, bound by loyalty, blood, and oath. Each man carried his own weapons, for in Viking society, a warrior was responsible for his own armament. At the heart of this lay the sword, the most prized possession a Viking could own. Forged with iron and steel, often imported from the forges of the Franks, a good sword was not only a tool of war, but an heirloom. Passed from father to son, its name carried through generations like a living soul. Yet the sword was rare, a treasure for the wealthy and noble. For most Vikings, the axe was the weapon of choice. Simple, brutal, effective, the axe could be a farmer's tool one day and a weapon of war the next. In skilled hands, it was deadly capable of cleaving through shields, helmets, and bone. Some axes were small, wielded in one hand with a shield in the other. Others were massive, two-handed weapons that could shatter a shield wall with a single swing. Among these, the fearsome Dane axe became legendary, its long haft and curved blade striking terror into all who faced it. But the true mark of the Viking warrior was not his sword, nor his axe, but his shield. The round shield, painted with bright colors and patterns, was more than protection. It was the foundation of Viking tactics. With shields interlocked, the Vikings formed the shield wall, a living wall of wood and iron that could advance like a wave or stand firm like a cliff against a storm. In this formation, the strength of one was the strength of all, and the weakness of one was the death of many. To break the shield wall was to break the Viking spirit, but to hold it was to stand as one against the world. And behind that wall, the Vikings unleashed their fury. Berserkers, shield walls, and tactics. Among the ranks of Viking warriors, there were those who stood apart. Men whispered of in fear and awe the Berserkers. These were warriors said to fight in a trance-like fury, immune to pain, driven by something beyond the natural world. Clad in the pelts of bears or wolves, they were believed to channel the spirit of the beast, losing all sense of fear or reason, fighting with a savagery so great that enemies broke and fled before them. Whether through ritual, hallucinogenic herbs, or sheer will, the Berserkers became legend. When they charged, it was as though Odin himself had sent them. Their presence alone could tilt the balance of battle, for even the bravest of men could not stand firm when faced with a foe who fought as though death were meaningless. And yet, the Berserker was not always a blessing, for their rage could not always be controlled. There are tales of Berserkers who turned their fury on friend as well as foe, consumed by the fire within until no distinction remained. But while the Berserkers embodied the wild fury of Viking war, the shield wall revealed its discipline. The Vikings were not mere marauders rushing blindly into battle. They were tacticians, organizers, soldiers who understood the value of unity. When their enemies saw them coming, they expected chaos, but what they faced was a wall of shields, advancing in perfect rhythm, spears and axes thrusting from the gaps, every man relying on the one beside him. The shield wall was not unique to the Vikings. Many Germanic and Saxon tribes had used it before, but the Norse perfected it. They knew when to hold the line, when to press forward, and when to feign retreat. The false retreat was among their deadliest tricks. A warband would break and scatter as if fleeing, luring their foes into pursuit. But as soon as the enemy line stretched and broke apart, the Vikings would turn as one, regroup, and fall upon their pursuers with devastating effect. To fight the Vikings was to fight not only their weapons, but their cunning. They struck swiftly, often at dawn, appearing without warning, using the sea as their road and the rivers as their pathways. They chose targets that were weak and rich monasteries, villages, trading towns, and they struck with precision. What made them truly dangerous was their adaptability. If resistance was strong, they withdrew and returned another day. If opportunity presented itself, they pressed harder. And over time, their raids grew into something greater: conquests, settlements, kingdoms carved from foreign soil. On the battlefield, their arsenal was as varied as their tactics. The spear was perhaps the most common weapon of all, favored for both its reach and its versatility. A Viking could thrust with it in the shield wall, hurl it across the field before the clash, or use it to hook an enemy's shield and drag it down. Many spears were simple iron-tipped shafts, but others were richly decorated, inscribed with runes, believed to carry the blessings or curses of the gods. Bows also played their part in Viking warfare. Though not as famed as the English longbow or the Mongol composite bow, the Norse bow was a deadly tool nonetheless. Made of yew, elm, or ash, it could strike from a distance, softening enemy lines before the melee began. In ambushes, Viking archers could rain arrows from hidden positions, breaking an enemy's formation before the shield wall advanced. Helmets and armor were less common than popular legend suggests. Few Vikings wore the horned helmets of modern imagination. That is a myth of later centuries. Most helmets were simple iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard, sometimes little more than hardened leather. Chainmail was rare and expensive, often the prize of the wealthy or the loot of battle. For the common warrior, protection was the shield, the courage of his heart, and the brotherhood of his companions. Yet courage alone did not win the battles. It was discipline, strategy, and the will to endure. In their clashes with Saxons, Franks, and Slavs, the Vikings proved themselves masters of adaptation. They fought in forests, in fields, in cities, and on the open sea. Their enemies often outnumbered them, But numbers meant little against men who fought as though death were only the beginning of glory. And what of glory? To a Viking, to die in battle was not defeat, it was the highest honor. The Skalds sang of Valhalla, Odin's great hall, where the slain warriors would feast and fight forever. To fall with a sword in hand was to earn a place among the Einherjar, the chosen of the gods. This belief gave the Vikings a fearlessness their enemies could not match. For what terror could death hold for a man who saw it not as an end, but as a doorway to eternal honor? This spirit carried them across Europe, carried them to victory after victory. Yet not all battles were won, and not all foes were easily broken. In England, the Saxons learned to resist. In Francia, fortified cities turned the tide. And in the east, the great walls of Constantinople stood tall against them. Still, for centuries, the Vikings remained the scourge of Europe, warriors whose name alone could silence a hall and chill the blood. But the tale is not yet done, for the true saga of Viking warfare lies not only in the weapons they carried or the battles they fought, but in the legacy they left behind. Famous battles and campaigns of the Vikings. The story of the Viking warrior cannot be told without the clash of great battles, for their legend was written not only in raids, but in wars that shook kingdoms. From the windswept shores of England to the mighty rivers of Francia, the Vikings carved their names into the chronicles of kings. One of the earliest and most infamous raids took place in the year 793, when longships descended upon the holy island of Lindisfarne. The monks there, devoted to prayer and peace, were unprepared for the storm that fell upon them. The Vikings tore through the monastery, slaughtering some, enslaving others, and taking treasures beyond measure. To the Christian world, it was not merely an attack, it was an omen, a sign that a new terror had risen from the sea. From that day forward, the Viking name carried a shadow of dread. In the centuries that followed, their raids grew larger, bolder, and more ambitious. By the mid-9th century, Viking fleets were no longer content with hit-and-run strikes. They came in armies, sailing up the great rivers of Europe, striking deep into the heart of kingdoms. Paris itself felt the weight of their fury. In 845, the Viking chieftain Ragnar Lodbrok, whether legend or truth, a name etched in saga, led a fleet of 120 ships up the river Seine. His warriors descended upon Paris with fire and steel, demanding tribute to spare the city. The Frankish king, Charles the Bold, had little choice but to pay them a massive ransom in gold and silver. It was a humiliation that would be repeated many times in the years to come, for the Vikings had discovered the art of ransom. To besiege a city was costly, but to threaten a city and be paid to leave was a victory without loss. Yet not all encounters ended in Viking triumph. In 885, another massive fleet returned to Paris, laying siege for nearly a year. This time, the defenders stood firm. Led by Count Odo, the Vikings fought with their usual ferocity, building siege engines, hurling fire, and cutting off supplies. But Paris endured. When reinforcements finally arrived, the Norse accepted tribute once more, but the legend of their invincibility had been tested. Even so, their reputation remained, and their ability to appear suddenly, to strike and vanish, continued to haunt Europe. In England, the struggle between Vikings and Saxons defined an era. The land was rich, fertile, and fractured into kingdoms, each vulnerable to the storm from the north. Beginning in the late 9th century, the so-called Great Heathen Army descended upon the land. It was not a band of raiders, but a true invasion force, numbering in the thousands, led by fearsome warlords, Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, Ub, and others whose names echoed like thunder. The Saxon kingdoms fell one by one. Northumbria, East Anglia, Mershall were torn apart. Only Wessex, under the leadership of Alfred the Great, resisted with success. Alfred understood that the Viking threat could not be met by scattered levies or untrained militias. He reformed his army, building fortified Burj strongholds that gave his people refuge and his warriors bases from which to strike. He built a fleet to challenge the Norse at sea, turning their own weapon, the Longship, against them. The clash between Alfred and the great heathen army was brutal, a war of attrition fought over decades. At the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred's forces met the Vikings in a decisive confrontation. Shield wall met shield wall, spears clashed, axes fell, and when the battle ended, it was Alfred who stood victorious. The Norse leader Guthrum was forced to accept baptism and retreat to East Anglia, marking a turning point in the struggle for England. Yet even after defeat, the Vikings remained, settling, ruling, and leaving their mark upon the land. Further east, the Viking way of war reached new horizons. Sailing down the great rivers of Russia, Norse warriors known there as the Rus founded trade routes and kingdoms. Their longships carried them to Novgorod, Kiev, and beyond. In 860, a Viking fleet appeared before the mighty city of Constantinople itself, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The Norse raiders struck swiftly, burning churches and plundering the countryside, before withdrawing with their spoils. The Byzantines would come to know the Vikings well, for they would serve not only as enemies, but as allies. From the north came the Varangians, warriors who swore service to the emperor himself. These men formed the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of battle-hardened Norse who fought as mercenaries in distant lands. Armed with mighty axes, loyal to the emperor above all, they became legendary in their own right. The Norse who once raided the city now defended it, carving out a new chapter in their saga. Throughout these campaigns, the Vikings showed a mastery of war that combined speed, adaptability, and psychological terror. They struck when least expected, retreating when necessary, always learning, always evolving. Their enemies built walls, towers, fleets, and armies to withstand them, but for centuries, the storm from the north could not be ignored. Yet as time passed, the Viking way of war began to change. No longer were they only raiders and invaders. They became rulers, kings, and settlers. Their weapons and tactics remained fierce, but their goals grew broader, their ambitions stretching beyond plunder to power, dominion, and legacy. Warrior kings and the twilight of the Vikings. As the Viking Age advanced into the 10th and 11th centuries, the warriors of the north were no longer only raiders and mercenaries. They became rulers, warlords, and kings, their ambitions no longer limited to plunder, but expanding to dominion over vast realms. Their way of war evolved with their rise to power, yet their reputation as fierce fighters endured. Among these warrior kings was Harald Fairhair of Norway, who according to saga united the Norse clans beneath a single crown. His victory at the Battle of Hafrsfjord in the late 9th century secured his rule, but it also marked a change. No longer would Viking chieftains roam freely without a king to command them. The age of smaller war bands was giving way to armies commanded by kings with grand designs. But perhaps the greatest warrior king of the later Viking Age was Harald Hardrada, the Thunderbolt of the North. Born into exile, raised in war, and tempered in foreign service, Harald embodied the fury and ambition of his people. In his youth, he fought in the east, serving in the Varangian Guard of Byzantium. There he gained wealth, experience, and a reputation for unmatched ferocity. He fought in Sicily, in the Holy Land, and in the heart of the empire, wielding his great axe as a captain among mercenaries. When Harald returned to Norway, he came not as a wanderer, but as a conqueror. Crowned king, he set his sights on expanding his power beyond Scandinavia. His dream was nothing less than the throne of England. In 1066, Harald launched his invasion, leading a fleet across the North Sea to claim the crown he believed was his by right. At his side marched thousands of battle-hardened warriors, and at their backs, the weight of centuries of Viking warfare. The campaign began with triumph. At the Battle of Fulford, near York, Harold's forces clashed with the English earls, Edwin and Mercar. The shield walls thundered together, and the Norse smashed through their foes, driving them from the field and seizing the city. It seemed as though England might once again fall to the warriors of the north. But fate, as always, had other plans. Only days later, King Harold Godwinson of England marched his army north, covering an astonishing distance in little more than a week. On the 25th of September, the two armies met at Stamford Bridge. The battle that followed was one of the most legendary in Viking history. The Norse had left much of their armor behind in the heat of the march, expecting only to receive hostages and tribute, not to face a king's army. Yet when the English appeared, they formed their shield wall and stood ready. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, shield to shield, axe against sword. One tale tells of a single Viking holding the narrow bridge across the River Derwent, felling dozens of Englishmen before he was finally struck down. Such stories, true or embellished, capture the spirit of that day, the stubborn courage of warriors who refused to yield. But courage alone could not turn the tide. Outnumbered, outmatched, and caught unprepared, the Norse were cut down in their thousands. And there, among the fallen, lay Harald Hardrada. An arrow to the throat ended the life of the last great Viking king, and with him ended an era. Stamford Bridge marked not only the death of a king, but the twilight of the Viking way of war. Yet the story did not end in silence. For only 3 weeks later, Harold Godwinson faced another invader, William, Duke of Normandy, himself descended from Viking settlers. At the Battle of Hastings, William triumphed and a new age began. The spirit of the Vikings lived on, transformed into the bloodlines of kings, the shaping of nations, the legacy of conquest. But in that final stand at Stamford Bridge, we see the essence of the Viking warrior. Outnumbered, surrounded, facing certain death, they fought with all the fury of the North. With the courage of men who believed that to die with sword in hand was the highest glory. They did not retreat, they did not beg, they did not falter. And though they fell, their saga endures. The Viking Age was not defined only by its beginning in raids and fire, nor by its end in the fall of a king. It was a transformation, a journey from wandering warbands to kingdoms and empires, from raiders of monasteries to rulers of lands, from shadows of terror to legends of history. Their weapons, their tactics, their shield walls, and their berserkers, all were but parts of a greater whole, a culture bound to war, to honor, and to the sea. Even after their age ended, the echoes of their way of war lived on. The Norman knights, descendants of Norsemen, carried their spirit into new lands. The Rus princes of Kiev bore their memory into the east. The sagas preserved their deeds in poetry and song, ensuring that the warriors of the North would never be forgotten. Legacy of the Viking way of war. The Viking way of war did not end with the fall of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. It lived on in the lands they conquered, the cultures they influenced, and the legends they left behind. Though their longships no longer prowled the coasts of Europe, the memory of their sails haunted the dreams of kings for centuries. Though their shield walls broke upon the fields of England, their tactics inspired armies long after their age had passed. The weapons of the Norsemen, swords, axes, spears, and shields, were not merely tools of violence. They were symbols of the values they held dear. The sword was the mark of nobility, treasured and named, a link between generations. The axe, humble yet deadly, spoke to the dual life of the Viking as farmer and warrior, a man of the land as well as the battlefield. The spear, favored by Odin himself, represented both the reach of the Norse across seas and rivers, and the power of unity in the shield wall. And the shield, round and sturdy, painted in bright colors, bound them together not only in defense but in brotherhood, for no Viking stood alone. Their tactics, their cunning, and their fearlessness made them more than raiders. They were explorers, settlers, traders, and kings. The The Varangian Guard carried their legacy into Byzantium. The Normans carried it into England, Italy, and beyond. The Rus princes forged kingdoms in the east. And even today, the saga of the Vikings lives on, retold in story and song, their memory preserved in runes and sagas, in castles and churches, in the very languages of the lands they touched. But above all, what endures is the spirit of the warrior of the North, a spirit that met fear with courage, death with honor, and the unknown with a relentless will to conquer. The Viking warrior lived by his weapons, by his ship, and by his faith in the gods who watched from above. To his enemies, he was terror. To his kin, he was brother. To his skalds, he was hero. And to history, he is immortal. So when we speak of the Vikings, we do not speak only of raids and plunder, of fire and blood. We speak of men and women who shaped the destiny of nations, whose ships carried them farther than any had dreamed, whose battles left scars upon the earth, and whose sagas echo still. They were warriors of the North, and though their age has ended, their story will never fade. For as long as the wind carries the cry of the raven, as long as the sea crashes against the rocks of the fjords, as long as the fire of battle stirs the heart, the Vikings will live on. Traveler, you have walked the fields of their battles, stood behind their shield walls, felt the roar of their war horns. You have seen their fury, their discipline, their triumph, and their fall. And now, as the saga closes, I call upon you to honor it. Strike your hammer upon the like button, that the gods themselves may hear your voice. Leave your words in the comments, as though carving runes into stone, so that others may know your thoughts. And join our fellowship by subscribing, so that the sagas may continue, and the fire of the North never be extinguished. For the battle may be done, but the story carries on. And those who stand with us shall forever be part of the shield wall. This has been the tale of the warriors of the North, the battles they fought, the weapons they bore, and the way of war that made them eternal. Until the next saga is told, may the gods watch over you, and may you always find the courage to stand firm as they once did upon the edge of the world.